5 years ago, my ex-husband Marcus threw me out of his family estate because a doctor falsely diagnosed me as infertile. Today, I sat in my luxury penthouse in Buckhead, holding a heavy gold-foiled invitation to his new wedding. Attached to the expensive cardstock was a handwritten sticky note with a message designed to ruin my life all over again. It read, "Come see the fulfilling life you will never have. Do not worry, I booked you a safe little seat at the singles table." He truly thought this pathetic piece of paper would finally break me. He had absolutely no idea that I was not only going to RSVP yes, but I was also going to bring 3 very special guests to his big day. Our 5-year-old triplets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to completely destroy a toxic ex who severely underestimated your worth. I sat back on my white leather sofa and let the afternoon sunlight wash over me. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows, a quiet testament to the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I looked down at the wedding invitation again. The thick, cream-colored paper was letterpressed with shining gold ink, proudly announcing the upcoming union of Marcus Sterling and his beautiful bride Chloe. The Sterling family was a staple of the local high society. They loved to project an image of absolute perfection, old money, and flawless genetics. For a brief moment, the sheer audacity of his handwritten note threatened to pull me back into the past. I traced my finger over his sprawling, arrogant handwriting. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel like the barren, discarded wife who had amounted to nothing. He wanted me to sit quietly in the back corner of a ballroom, watching him marry the woman he had cheated on me with, crying into a glass of cheap champagne. But I did not cry. I did not shed a single tear. I had already cried all my tears 5 years ago on the cold concrete steps of the Sterling mansion, clutching a piece of paper that proved the initial doctor was wrong. A piece of paper that confirmed I was pregnant naturally with 3 babies. But on that night, Marcus and his mother Beatrice had already made up their minds. They had called me a dead tree, a useless addition to their prestigious bloodline, and they had slammed the door in my face. I realized then that my children would never be safe in that toxic environment. So I kept my mouth shut. I walked away, I had my babies in secret, and I spent the next 5 years turning myself into an unstoppable force. Now at 34 years old, I was a highly successful venture capital director. I controlled assets that Marcus could only dream of. In fact, through a series of anonymous shell companies, I had just quietly purchased the management rights to the Sterling Family Trust. Marcus still thought I was a struggling administrative assistant, barely making rent. He had no clue that the woman he was mocking was currently holding the financial strings to his entire family legacy. I took a slow sip of my herbal tea, feeling a cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. The sheer arrogance of his invitation was the perfect catalyst for what I was about to do. I could hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the playroom down the hall. Leo, Lance, and Lily were busy building a massive tower out of wooden blocks. They were brilliant, healthy, and fiercely independent 5-year-olds. And worst of all for Marcus, they were the absolute spitting image of the Sterling family line. They had his sharp jawline, his striking eyes, and his confident posture. There was no denying who they belonged to. I placed the wedding invitation on the glass coffee table and picked up my phone. I dialed the number for my personal assistant, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "Hello, I need you to drop whatever you are doing and arrange an emergency fitting with my personal tailor. Yes, for the children. I need 3 custom-tailored suits made immediately. I want the finest Italian fabrics you can source. Make sure they are perfectly tailored, sharp, and identical. We have a highly exclusive society wedding to attend this weekend, and my children are going to look like absolute royalty." After ending the call, I walked over to the mirror hanging in the hallway. The woman looking back at me was calm, collected, and ready for war. I was not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I was not going to sit at a singles table near the restrooms and watch the man who broke my heart gloat over his new life. I was going to walk through the front doors of that extravagant venue and let the truth speak for itself. I was going to show the entire city of Atlanta exactly what the Sterling family threw away. They wanted to make a public spectacle out of my supposed failures, so I was going to give them a performance they would never forget. The trap was set, the invitation was accepted, and the ticking clock to their absolute destruction had officially started. 5 years ago, the air inside the sprawling Sterling estate in Buckhead felt thick enough to choke on. I remember the exact sound my heels made against the imported Italian marble floor as I walked through the front doors. I had just returned from a secondary fertility specialist, seeking a second opinion after a devastating preliminary diagnosis the week prior. I expected to find my husband waiting for me in the living room, ready to discuss our options and figure out a path forward together. Instead, I found my entire life neatly packed into 4 designer suitcases lined up by the grand staircase. Beatrice Sterling stood by the piano nursing a glass of neat bourbon. She wore a tailored emerald suit, her posture rigid, and her eyes devoid of any warmth. She did not even bother to offer a greeting. She simply swirled the amber liquid in her glass and pointed a manicured finger at the luggage. "The bags are packed, Maya. We are done wasting time here." I stared at her, my heart hammering against my ribs, before turning to see Marcus descending the stairs. He would not even look me in the eye. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke shirt, his jaw tight and unyielding. The first doctor was clear, Maya. He said, his voice completely void of the warmth I had fallen in love with. "You cannot conceive. You know how important the bloodline is to my family. The Sterling legacy requires heirs. We have an empire to pass down, and I cannot spend the next decade doing expensive science experiments that might never work." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of his words, another sound echoed from the top of the stairs. Footsteps, light, confident, and entirely too familiar. Chloe appeared on the landing. She was a woman who had orbited our social circle for years, always lingering just a little too long at charity galas and country club dinners. But she was not dressed for a gala today. She was descending my staircase wearing my custom silk robe, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. Marcus reached out and pulled her close to his side as she reached the bottom step. "Chloe understands what this family needs," he stated, finally looking directly at me. "We have been seeing each other for a few months. She is young, she is healthy, and she can give me the family you cannot." Beatrice stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. "A barren woman has no place in this house," she said, her tone laced with absolute venom. "The Sterling wealth is reserved for the future, not a dead tree that cannot bear fruit. Marcus needs a woman who can multiply his success, not halt it. You are a bad investment, Maya. It is time to cut our losses." I stood there in the grand foyer, absorbing the absolute betrayal unfolding in front of me. My husband of 3 years had not only given up on me after a single medical hurdle, but he had also brought his mistress into our home and allowed his mother to orchestrate my swift exit. My hand tightened around the leather handle of my purse. My knuckles turned white, but it was not from anger or devastation. It was from the desperate need to protect what was inside that bag. Hidden deep inside my purse was a crisp white envelope from the specialist I had just visited. The first doctor, the one Beatrice had personally recommended and paid for, had been spectacularly wrong. I was not infertile. In fact, the ultrasound images currently burning a hole in my bag proved the exact opposite. I was pregnant, naturally pregnant. And I was not just expecting one child, I was carrying triplets. For a fraction of a second, the urge to pull that paper out was almost overwhelming. I could have slapped those ultrasound scans onto the marble console table. I could have watched Beatrice drop her bourbon glass in shock. I could have watched the color drain from Marcus's face as he realized he was throwing away exactly what he claimed to want. I could have destroyed Chloe's momentary victory with a single piece of paper. But as I looked at the 3 of them, a chilling realization washed over me. If I told them about the babies right now, they would never let me leave. They would trap me in this house. Beatrice would try to take control of my children, molding them into heartless, arrogant, superficial replicas of the Sterling brand. Marcus would use them as props for his corporate image, parading them around Atlanta high society while continuing to sleep with women like Chloe behind my back. My children would become assets in their toxic portfolio, raised in an environment utterly devoid of genuine love or respect. These babies deserved better than the Sterling Empire. They deserved a mother who would fiercely protect them, not a family that viewed them as mere extensions of a bank account. I did not scream. I did not beg for my marriage. I did not shed a single tear for the man standing in front of me. I simply looked at Marcus, taking in the profound weakness hiding behind his expensive suit and family name. "You are making the biggest mistake of your entire life," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Marcus scoffed, pulling Chloe closer by her waist. "Just leave your house keys on the tray, Maya. The driver is waiting outside to take you wherever you need to go." I unclipped my keys from my ring and dropped them onto the silver tray. The loud clatter echoed through the silent foyer. I picked up my suitcases, turning my back on the people who thought they had just ruined my life. I walked out the heavy oak doors without a single backward glance, my hand resting gently and protectively over my stomach. They thought they were throwing away a broken, useless woman. They had absolutely no idea they were throwing away the exact legacy they were so desperately obsessed with securing. That was the day the old Maya died. The woman who walked down those driveway steps was a mother protecting her young, and a mother with a vendetta is the most dangerous creature on earth. I spent the next 5 years turning that heartbreak into a multi-million-dollar venture capital firm, fighting tooth and nail to build an empire that eclipsed theirs in every measurable way. I raised Leo, Lance, and Lily with more love and strength than Marcus could ever comprehend. And now, as I looked back at the gold-foiled wedding invitation sitting on my coffee table, I knew the time for hiding was officially over. The gold-foiled invitation sat on my glass coffee table, practically mocking me with its thick, expensive cardstock. I reached for my cooling cup of herbal tea, a sharp, deeply satisfying smile forming on my lips. Marcus and Beatrice thought they had buried me 5 years ago. They had no idea they had merely planted a seed. Today, I was not the discarded, weeping wife they threw onto the driveway. I was the managing director of Vanguard Horizon, one of the most ruthless and successful venture capital firms in Atlanta. While Marcus had spent the last 5 years coasting on his family name, draining the sterling assets on flashy failed tech startups and exorbitant country club memberships, I had been acquiring power. I operated quietly, letting the industry men underestimate me, right up until the moment I bought them out. Wealth is loud, but true power is entirely silent. That silence had been my greatest weapon. Just 2 weeks ago, my firm finalized the acquisition of a lifetime. The Sterling Family Trust was not just a bank account. It was the bedrock of their entire social standing within Atlanta's elite. It funded their charity galas, their sprawling estate in Buckhead, and Beatrice's flawless reputation among the high society matriarchs. Desperate to cover Marcus's staggering investment debts and maintain their lavish lifestyle for this upcoming wedding, they had quietly leveraged their most sacred asset. The management rights to the trust had been put up as collateral to a private equity group. When Marcus inevitably defaulted on his shadow loans, those rights were liquidated. They thought their dirty laundry was safe hidden behind closed-door boardroom deals that no one in their social circle would ever see. They were wrong. Through a complex web of anonymous Delaware shell companies, I swooped in and bought the debt. I now owned the exclusive management rights to the Sterling Family Trust. Every piece of real estate, every corporate dividend, every single dollar that Marcus and Beatrice planned to spend on this ridiculous over-the-top wedding required my ultimate approval. They were literally partying on my dime, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman they threw away now held the keys to their entire kingdom. A sudden burst of giggles from down the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. The heavy, calculating coldness in my chest instantly melted into absolute warmth. I set down my tea and walked toward the playroom. Pushing the mahogany door open, I found my 3 greatest achievements sitting on the plush carpet. Leo, Lance, and Lily were deeply focused on building an elaborate fortress out of wooden blocks. They were 5 years old, bright, fiercely independent, and breathtakingly beautiful. It felt like a cosmic joke played on the Sterling family. My children possessed the exact, undeniable features of the Sterling bloodline. They had Marcus's sharp jawline, his striking hazel eyes, and that unmistakable proud posture that Beatrice always bragged about. But beneath that exterior, they had my resilience. They had my fire. I knelt on the carpet, bringing myself down to their eye level. "My sweet babies," I said softly, gathering their attention. "We have a very important event to attend this weekend. We are going to a massive party at a beautiful mansion." Leo, always the analytical one, tilted his head. "Is there going to be a big cake, Mommy?" I smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Yes, my love, a huge cake. There will be beautiful music, lots of flowers, and we are going to be the most important guests there." Lily clapped her hands together, her hazel eyes shining with excitement. "Do I get to wear a pretty dress?" "You are going to wear the most beautiful dress in the world," I promised her. "And Leo and Lance are going to wear very sharp custom suits. But I need you three to make a promise to me." They immediately stopped playing, giving me their undivided attention. They knew my serious tone. "When we walk into that party, there are going to be a lot of people staring at you. Some of them might look very surprised. There might even be an older lady who looks angry and a man who looks exactly like you." I held out my hands and they placed their small palms in mine. "No matter what happens, I want you to stand up completely straight. I want you to hold your heads high, and I want you to hold on to each other's hands tightly. You belong in any room you walk into. Do you understand?" Lance squeezed my fingers. "We promise, Mommy. We will be brave." I pulled all three of them into a tight embrace, inhaling the sweet scent of their shampoo. They were my entire world. Beatrice Sterling had once called me a dead tree, a useless investment that needed to be cut loose. She wanted pure Sterling heirs, and she was willing to destroy my life to get them. Now her only legitimate grandchildren were completely out of her reach, raised by the very woman she despised. These children were the legal biological future of the Sterling Empire, and they belonged entirely to me. I stood up, leaving them to their game, and walked back to the living room. I picked up my phone and dialed my executive assistant. She answered on the first ring. "I need you to contact my personal tailor immediately." I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. "We have a high society wedding to attend this Saturday. I need 3 bespoke outfits for the children. Italian silk flawless cuts. They need to look like absolute royalty. And for me, I want something bold. I want a dress that commands the entire room the second I step through the doors." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the sofa. Marcus wanted me to watch him celebrate a life built on my pain. He wanted me seated at a sad little table near the kitchen, a prop in his grand play of superiority. He expected a broken, defeated woman to show up and shrink under his gaze. Instead, he was going to get a queen backed by the true heirs to his throne, ready to repossess everything he claimed to own. The clock was ticking, and the Sterling family was about to learn that karma does not just knock on your door. Sometimes it kicks the door completely off its hinges. The Sterling estate in Buckhead was entirely transformed into a spectacle of unearned extravagance. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the balconies, wrapping around the towering marble columns of the grand entrance. A 12-piece string quartet played a delicate classical arrangement on the pristine front lawn, providing the soundtrack for Atlanta's most elite African-American families to mingle. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of absolute power. Judges, tech tycoons, real estate moguls, and legacy families stood on the manicured grass holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. Women draped in diamonds and custom silk gowns exchanged polite, calculated smiles, while men in bespoke tuxedos discussed their investment portfolios and corporate acquisitions. This was not just a wedding. It was a calculated display of dominance, a performance orchestrated by Beatrice Sterling to prove that her family remained at the absolute pinnacle of Southern high society. Standing at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, leading to the main ballroom, were Marcus and his beautiful new bride, Chloe. She wore a bridal gown completely covered in hand-stitched Swarovski crystals, a dress that undoubtedly cost more than a luxury vehicle. She was laughing, tossing her head back, playing the role of the triumphant new matriarch perfectly. Marcus stood beside her looking effortlessly arrogant in a tailored velvet dinner jacket. He shook hands with senators and nodded at wealthy investors, completely secure in his fabricated reality. They were standing on an estate funded by a trust they no longer controlled, celebrating a future they could no longer afford, surrounded by people who only respected their bank accounts. The heavy, distinctive crunch of tires on the imported gravel driveway suddenly shifted the atmosphere. The main gates of the estate, usually reserved for the bridal party and immediate family, swung open. A sleek, midnight black Maybach glided past the designated valet area, ignoring the frantic gestures of the parking attendants. The vehicle moved with silent, heavy authority, pulling directly up to the base of the grand staircase, parking right on the edge of the red carpet. The string quartet faltered for a fraction of a second. Conversations among the elite guests began to quiet down as curiosity took over. In a social circle where status was everything, pulling a vehicle directly to the front steps was a brazen power move. Everyone turned their attention to the tinted windows, waiting to see which billionaire or politician commanded such blatant disrespect for the wedding protocols. The uniformed driver stepped out, walking around the vehicle with precise military posture. He reached the passenger door and pulled it open. I stepped out into the warm Atlanta afternoon, the fabric of my dress catching the sunlight like liquid fire. I did not wear pastel colors, and I certainly did not wear the polite, muted tones expected of a discarded, humiliated ex-wife. I wore a commanding, deep crimson gown that swept against the red carpet, structured and sharp, projecting absolute power. My hair was styled flawlessly, framing a face that held no sorrow, no regret, and absolutely no fear. I closed the door behind me and stood at the base of the stairs, looking directly up at the man who had thrown me away. A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd. The women who used to invite me to their charity luncheons before cutting me off stared in absolute shock. The men who had done business with Marcus lowered their champagne glasses. They recognized me immediately. I was supposed to be the tragic barren woman who faded into obscurity. I was supposed to be a cautionary tale whispered about in country club locker rooms. Instead, I looked wealthier, sharper, and vastly more powerful than anyone currently standing on the Sterling property. At the top of the stairs, Marcus froze. The charming, arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His hand dropped from Chloe's waist. He took a rigid step forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the stone balustrade. Chloe noticed his sudden paralysis and followed his gaze down to the driveway. Her triumphant glow shattered instantly, her eyes widening in confusion and rising dread. But I was not finished. The true shockwave was just seconds away. I turned back to the Maybach as the driver opened the heavy rear doors. I extended my hand, and one by one my children stepped out onto the red carpet. Leo emerged first, buttoning his miniature tailored Italian suit jacket with a level of composure that terrified the adults watching him. He reached back and took his sister's hand. Lily stepped into the light wearing a breathtaking crimson silk dress that perfectly matched my own, her hazel eyes scanning the massive crowd with fearless curiosity. Finally, Lance stepped out, completing the trio, adjusting his tiny silk tie, his jaw set in a determined, serious line. I had told them to stand up straight and hold their heads high, and my children executed that instruction flawlessly. They stood in a perfect line beside me, gripping each other's hands, looking up at the sprawling estate, like conquering royalty arriving to inspect their new domain. The silence that fell over the estate was absolute and deafening. It was not a gradual quieting. It was an instant suffocating paralysis. The string quartet completely stopped playing. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand, the crystal shattering loudly against the pavement, but no one even flinched. Every single pair of eyes in that elite gathering darted frantically from the 3 children standing beside me straight up to the groom, standing at the top of the stairs, and then back down again. There was no need for a dramatic announcement. There was no need for a paternity test or a public declaration. The truth was written on their faces in undeniable ink. Leo, Lance, and Lily were the exact flawless replicas of Marcus Sterling. They shared his distinct, sharp jawline. They had the exact same striking hazel eyes that had been a hallmark of the Sterling bloodline for 4 generations. The way Leo stood with his shoulders squared and his chin tilted slightly upward was a perfect, terrifying mirror image of the man staring down at him. The whispering began. It started as a low hum, a rapid, scandalous exchange of realizations spreading like wildfire among the wealthy guests. The elite African-American society of Atlanta thrived on pristine reputations and guarded secrets, and I had just detonated a nuclear bomb right in the center of their most anticipated social event of the decade. The whispers grew louder, piercing through the suffocating silence. The guests were piecing the timeline together, realizing that the infertile, discarded ex-wife had been hiding the ultimate Sterling heirs this entire time. I looked up the staircase. Marcus looked as though the air had been violently ripped from his lungs. His chest heaved, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. He stared at the 3 tiny versions of himself, his mind violently crashing against the reality of what he was seeing. 5 years ago, he had thrown me out because he needed a legacy. Now that exact legacy was standing at his front door, completely out of his reach and entirely under my control. A few feet away from Marcus, standing near the floral archway, Beatrice Sterling emerged from the crowd of guests. She had been busy greeting a local politician when the silence swept the lawn. As she stepped forward and looked down the staircase, the color completely drained from her face. The matriarch of the Sterling family, the woman who had orchestrated my removal with icy, ruthless precision, physically staggered backward. She reached out and grabbed the floral archway to keep herself from collapsing. Her impeccably lifted face crumbling into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. I did not break eye contact with Marcus. I placed my hands gently on Leo and Lily's shoulders, feeling their steady, brave posture. I offered Marcus a cold, razor-sharp smile, the exact kind of smile he had given me the day he ruined my life. I had accepted his invitation. I had brought my +3s. The destruction of the Sterling family image was officially underway, and I had not even spoken a single word yet. The absolute silence was finally broken by a sharp crystalline shatter. The vintage champagne flute slipped from Chloe's trembling fingers, exploding into glittering shards across the pristine white marble of the upper landing. The expensive liquid splashed onto the hem of her custom Swarovski gown, but she did not even blink. Her eyes were locked entirely onto my children. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, as the narrative she had built her entire future on crumbled into dust right before her eyes. She was supposed to be the savior of the Sterling bloodline. She was supposed to be the fertile, perfect bride who secured the family wealth. Now she was staring at 3 living, breathing heirs who had just rendered her entirely obsolete. Beside her, Marcus looked as though he had been violently struck by lightning. His arrogant posture collapsed. He took a jerky, unsteady step backward, almost tripping over Chloe's massive train. His mouth opened, forming the shape of my name, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I could see the gears violently grinding in his head. 5 years ago, he had relied on a single, flawed medical document to throw me away like trash. Now his brain was desperately trying to process the impossible mathematics standing right in front of him. 3 children, 5 years old, the exact timeline of our brutal divorce, the flawless replication of his own face. It was an undeniable, catastrophic truth that left him utterly paralyzed. The initial shockwave of silence among the guests rapidly dissolved into a chaotic, buzzing hive of whispers. This was the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta elite society, a highly exclusive group of people who traded heavily in secrets, reputation, and social currency. I saw Judge Harrison, a longtime political ally of the Sterlings, lean over to whisper urgently to his wife. I caught the eye of Senator Davis, who was shaking his head in sheer disbelief. They were doing the math. Everyone in that sprawling courtyard was doing the math. The Sterling family had spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a tragic, barren woman who simply could not handle the pressure of their grand legacy. They had painted Marcus as the long-suffering, dutiful husband who had to make a difficult choice for the sake of his family's future. That carefully curated lie was currently being dismantled in front of 500 of their most important investors, political allies, and social rivals. The pressure on the Sterling family was palpable. The air felt heavy with impending ruin. Every camera phone in the crowd was subtly shifting position. I could hear the faint, rapid clicks of photos being taken. By tomorrow morning, this exact scene would be the only thing discussed in every high-end salon-exclusive golf course and executive boardroom in Georgia. Holding firmly to my children's hands, I took my first deliberate step up the grand staircase. The guests physically parted to make way for us. It was like watching the sea split open. Women in designer gowns stepped back hurriedly, pulling their silk skirts out of our path, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and ravenous curiosity. Men who had previously ignored my existence now stared at me with newfound cautious respect. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate cadence of a woman who completely owned the ground she stepped on. My crimson dress flowed behind me, a stark, powerful contrast to the sea of polite pastels and suffocating white florals. At the top of the stairs, Chloe finally found her voice. It was not the sweet, melodic tone she usually used to charm country club waitstaff. It was a shrill, trembling gasp of absolute panic. She grabbed Marcus by the arm, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the velvet fabric of his jacket. "Marcus, who are they?" she demanded, her voice carrying sharply over the murmurs of the crowd. "Tell me right now, who are these children?" Marcus could not answer her. He could not even look at her. His wide, terrified gaze was anchored to Leo. My son stared right back at him, utterly unfazed by the towering panic-stricken man. Leo had my calm demeanor, a terrifying weapon, against a man who thrived on intimidation. Marcus raised a shaking hand, pointing a trembling finger toward us, but his throat bobbed uselessly. The wealthy, charismatic corporate heir, the man who commanded boardrooms and dictated market trends to the entire city, was reduced to a speechless, terrified shell of a man. The social damage was accumulating by the second. I saw Patricia Caldwell, the president of the Heritage Society. Beatrice, so proudly chaired, cover her mouth with a gloved hand, leaning in to gossip with a prominent real estate developer. They were already questioning Marcus's integrity. In their world, a man who abandoned his true heirs was a liability. If he could lie so brazenly about his own blood, how could any of these investors trust him with their money? Beatrice Sterling's perfectly curated world was bleeding out on the steps of her own estate. The humiliation was absolute, the scandal was irreversible, and I had not even reached the top of the stairs yet. The spell of absolute paralysis holding the Sterling family hostage broke the second Beatrice realized her entire social empire was disintegrating. Survival instinct, honed over decades of ruthless country club politics, violently kicked in. She pushed away from the floral archway, her knuckles white, and marched down the grand staircase. She shoved past a paralyzed Marcus and a trembling Chloe, her expensive heels striking the marble steps like a gavel demanding order. As she closed the distance between us, I could see the frantic, desperate calculation in her eyes. She was trying to construct a narrative, a lie powerful enough to save her family from the undeniable truth standing right in front of her. She stopped 2 steps above me, attempting to use the elevation to maintain her usual physical dominance. Her chest heaved under her tailored silk suit, and she leaned in close, lowering her voice into a venomous, trembling hiss that she foolishly hoped the surrounding crowd would not catch. "You have lost your absolute mind, Maya," she spat, her eyes darting frantically between the faces of my 3 children. "I do not know what kind of sick, twisted game you are playing, or what orphanage you scoured to find these kids, but this is a new low even for a desperate, unstable woman like you. How much are you paying their real parents to use them as props? Are you truly so pathetic that you would stage a stunt like this just to extort a payout from my son?" The sheer absurdity of her gaslighting was almost comical. 5 years ago, her words would have pierced my heart. I would have stammered, defended myself, and shrunk under her withering glare. But today her insults landed like harmless raindrops against a titanium vault. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly still, radiating the kind of absolute, unbothered calm that only comes from knowing you hold every single card in the deck. I slowly looked her up and down, letting my gaze sweep over her trembling frame with surgical precision. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, allowing her to feel the crushing weight of the hundreds of guests watching her unravel. When I finally spoke, I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone smooth, melodic, and devastatingly quiet, forcing the influential politicians and socialites leaning in from the lawn to hold their breath just to hear my response. Beatrice. I said, my voice carrying the casual authority of a billionaire addressing a minor inconvenience. I suggest you take a very deep breath and lower your tone. You are embarrassing yourself in front of your very important guests, and your neck is breaking out in hives. It ruins the aesthetic of your lovely pearls. Her mouth opened in shock, completely derailed by my refusal to engage with her hysteria. She reached out, her manicured fingers curled like claws, attempting to grab my arm to pull me away from the crowd. Before her fingers could even graze the fabric of my dress, I took a deliberate half-step forward, cutting off her personal space. "Do not touch me," I warned, my voice dropping an octave into a tone made of pure ice. "The custom silk I am wearing is worth significantly more than the entire floral budget you scraped together for this tacky charade. If you ruin it, you simply cannot afford to replace it." Beatrice physically recoiled, her hand snatching back to her chest, as if she had been burned. Her eyes widened, scanning my flawless gown, the bespoke tailoring of my children's suits, and the massive, glittering diamonds resting against my collarbone. The narrative she had built of the poor, destitute ex-wife was violently clashing with the reality of the impossibly wealthy woman standing before her. "These children are not actors, Beatrice." I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "They are the only legitimate heirs this family has left. Look at their eyes. Look at their faces. You have spent your entire life bragging about the supremacy of the Sterling bloodline. Are you truly going to stand here in front of the most powerful families in Atlanta and pretend you do not recognize your own reflection?" Beatrice looked down at Leo. My son did not look away. He stared back at his grandmother with a cool, detached curiosity, his sharp hazel eyes perfectly mirroring the signature Sterling gaze. The undeniable truth of his genetics struck Beatrice so hard she visibly swayed on her feet. "You hid them," she gasped, her voice cracking as her anger mutated into sheer panic. "You kept my grandchildren from me. You vindictive, deceitful woman. You stole the Sterling heirs." "I did not steal anything," I corrected her, my words striking with the precision of a scalpel. "You threw us away. You called me a dead tree. You explicitly told Marcus to cut his losses because I was a bad investment. You orchestrated my removal from this family based on a fraudulent medical diagnosis because you were too impatient and too arrogant to wait for the truth. I simply took out the trash for you. I protected my investments, and I built an empire that makes your little trust fund look like pocket change. I do not need your money, Beatrice. I do not want your status. I am simply here to show you exactly what you threw away so you can spend the rest of your miserable life choking on the regret." Beatrice opened her mouth to scream, her perfectly maintained high society facade completely disintegrating into unhinged desperation. She turned wildly toward the crowd, waving her hands in a frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully across the manicured lawn. "Someone call security right now. Remove this woman and these imposters from my property. Get them off my estate immediately." Two massive security guards in dark tailored suits immediately broke through the perimeter of stunned guests, marching briskly toward the grand staircase. Beatrice's shrill command had broken the trance, and Marcus suddenly found a pathetic shred of his hollow courage. He stood up straighter, pointing a trembling finger down at me. "You heard my mother," Marcus ordered, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of the watchful crowd. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is trespassing." The guards reached the bottom of the marble steps, their expressions grim and professional. I did not flinch. I tightened my grip on Leo and Lily's hands and took a firm, protective stance. I knew the law better than anyone in this family, but the absolute last thing I wanted was a physical altercation in front of my 5-year-old children. I prepared to deliver a verbal warning that would freeze the guards in their tracks, but I did not have to. "Stand exactly where you are," a booming, authoritative voice echoed across the courtyard. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped directly out of the crowd of paralyzed socialites and positioned himself squarely between the advancing security guards and my family. It was Liam. He adjusted his suit jacket, his blue eyes entirely devoid of fear as he stared down the guards. Liam was married to Nia Marcus's younger sister. He was a brilliant, fair-minded corporate attorney, but the Sterling family had never truly respected him. Because Liam was white and came from a working-class background in the Midwest, Beatrice had always treated him as an unfortunate blemish on their elite old money pedigree. They tolerated him only because of his legal brilliance, but they never missed an opportunity to remind him that he was an outsider. Yet standing there on the red carpet, Liam was the only man on the entire estate with an ounce of genuine integrity. "Liam, step aside right now," Marcus demanded, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "This is a private family matter. It does not concern you. It concerns me when my brother-in-law is about to commit massive legal and public relations suicide on his own front lawn." Liam fired back his courtroom baritone, cutting effortlessly through the humid Georgia air. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging the sea of influential judges, politicians, and investors hanging on to his every word. "As an officer of the court and a member of this family, I am saving you from yourself, Marcus. You cannot trespass a guest who was explicitly invited to this event." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking scoff from the top of the stairs. "Invited? She is a deranged stalker crashing a private celebration. I want her arrested." Liam ignored the frantic matriarch and reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit. He pulled out his own thick, gold-foiled wedding invitation and held it up for the surrounding guests to see. "The invitation you personally mailed to Maya clearly stated Maya and guests. It was not a private note. It was a formal request for her attendance. She formally RSVP'd through your wedding planner. She is a documented, legally invited guest at this venue." Marcus gritted his teeth, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "That was a joke, Liam. It was a private joke between exes. It does not give her the right to bring these strangers onto my property to ruin my wedding." "Are you seriously going to order your armed security team to lay hands on an invited guest in front of half the state's judicial branch?" Liam challenged, taking a step closer to the stairs, forcing Marcus to look him dead in the eye. "Think about the optics, Marcus. Think about the immediate lawsuits. Think about the viral videos that are already being recorded by your own guests." Liam then lowered his gaze to my 3 children. His stern expression softened for a fraction of a second. A quiet, knowing look passed between us. Liam had always seen through the Sterling family's toxic facade, and looking at the children, he instantly understood the magnitude of the truth I had brought to light. His jaw tightened, and he glared fiercely back up at his brother-in-law. "And look at these children, Marcus," Liam continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous warning register. "Are you truly prepared to have 3 5-year-olds forcibly dragged off this property by grown men? 3 children who, as anyone with functioning eyes, can clearly see bear a striking, undeniable resemblance to you." The surrounding crowd erupted into loud, validating murmurs. Liam had brilliantly voiced the exact thought running through every single investor's mind. "If you lay a single hand on them," Liam warned, his words striking like precise hammer blows, "the scandal tomorrow will not just be about an uninvited ex-wife crashing a party. It will be front-page news across the country that Marcus Sterling used physical violence to violently eject his own hidden heirs. The stock price of Sterling Enterprises will absolutely plummet before you even get the chance to cut your wedding cake. You will be ruined, Marcus, not just socially, but financially." The color completely drained from Marcus's face. The reality of Liam's legal and social assessment hit him like a freight train. He looked frantically at the crowd. He saw Senator Davis nodding in agreement with Liam. He saw the wealthy matriarchs whispering behind their designer clutches, their eyes filled with absolute judgment. To use force now would confirm every horrible rumor currently spreading through the garden. It would paint Marcus as a violent deadbeat father attacking his own bloodline to protect a fragile lie. Beatrice tried to interject, opening her mouth to shout another command, but Marcus threw his hand up to silence his own mother. He was trapped, utterly backed into a corner of his own making. The arrogant groom who had tried to humiliate me with a piece of paper was now being suffocated by the very rules of the high society he worshipped. "Stand down!" Marcus muttered, his voice cracking with defeated, bitter rage. He refused to look at me, staring instead at the marble steps beneath his expensive shoes. I said, "Stand down. Let them stay." The security guards exchanged a quick glance before backing away, dissolving seamlessly back into the perimeter of the crowd. Liam gave me a brief, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement between the only two people who truly understood the depth of the Sterling family's depravity. He turned and walked back to his wife in the crowd, leaving the path completely clear. I tightened my hold on my children's hands, a cold, triumphant fire burning in my chest. The first defense line had fallen, and I was finally stepping into the heart of their spectacular ruin. The sea of elite guests parted silently as I guided my children across the manicured lawn and toward the grand reception ballroom. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, with the unspoken judgment of Atlanta's most influential families. We walked with purpose, ignoring the sharp stares and the frantic whispers. Leo, Lance, and Lily matched my pace perfectly, their small hands gripping mine with the steady confidence I had instilled in them since birth. We crossed the threshold into the sprawling ballroom, a breathtaking space draped in white silk and illuminated by massive crystal chandeliers. A towering seating chart carved into a slab of frosted glass stood at the entrance. A quick glance revealed my name placed deliberately at the very bottom of the list, Table 84. I led the children through the maze of beautifully decorated tables, moving further and further away from the center of the room. As we walked, the extravagant floral centerpieces became smaller, the ambient light grew dimmer, and the spacing between the tables became cramped. We finally arrived at our assigned location, and the sheer pettiness of Marcus's plan became glaringly obvious. Table 84 was shoved into a dark, drafty corner at the absolute back of the venue. It was positioned directly between the aggressively swinging doors of the catering kitchen and the heavily trafficked corridor leading to the guest restrooms. The table itself wobbled slightly on the marble floor. Instead of the plush velvet seating provided to the other guests, Marcus had arranged for us to have stiff, uncomfortable wooden folding chairs. I looked across the vast ballroom toward the elevated sweetheart table at the front of the room. Marcus and Chloe had taken their seats. Chloe was adjusting her massive diamond necklace, her earlier panic temporarily masked by a venomous, triumphant smirk. Marcus caught my eye from across the room. He raised his crystal champagne flute in my direction, offering a slow, mocking toast. He truly believed he had won. He thought that by banishing me to the shadows, he could force me to endure his celebration in silent, humiliating submission. He expected me to sit in the drafty corner, smelling the harsh cleaning supplies from the restrooms and dodging waiters carrying dirty plates. I did not sit down. I looked down at my children who were waiting patiently for my instruction. "Stay right here, my loves," I said, my voice calm and reassuring. "Mommy needs to make a very quick phone call." I opened my custom designer clutch and pulled out my phone. I bypassed my assistant and dialed a number I kept saved for high-level emergencies. The phone rang only once before it was answered. "Good evening, Ms. Sterling," a polished, highly professional voice answered. It was Julian, the regional director of operations for the Prestige Hospitality Group. "Julian," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and entirely devoid of anger, "I am currently attending an event at the Buckhead estate property. It seems there has been a severe oversight regarding my seating arrangements. I am standing next to the kitchen doors, which is an entirely unacceptable position for the woman who recently purchased your entire parent company." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The Prestige Hospitality Group was the crown jewel of the Atlanta event industry, managing the most exclusive venues in the state. What Marcus and his wedding planner did not know was that Vanguard Horizon, my venture capital firm, had finalized a hostile takeover of the group just 3 weeks ago. I was not just an invited guest. I owned the very floor Marcus was currently standing on. "I am so incredibly sorry, Ms. Sterling." Julian stammered, his usual calm completely abandoning him. "I will rectify this immediately. Please give me exactly 2 minutes." I slipped my phone back into my clutch and placed my hands gently on Leo and Lance's shoulders. We stood completely still, ignoring the curious glances of the distant relatives and shunned socialites seated near us. Across the room, Marcus noticed I was still standing. His triumphant smile began to falter, replaced by a deep, familiar furrow of his brow. He leaned forward, squinting through the ambient lighting, trying to figure out why I was not shrinking into the background like he had planned. Less than 90 seconds later, the heavy brass doors at the side of the ballroom flew open. Julian, dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo, marched into the room with the frantic intensity of a general answering a distress call. Behind him was a small army of venue staff, including the head maitre d' and 12 servers in crisp white jackets. They were not carrying food, they were carrying furniture. The sudden commotion caught the attention of the entire ballroom. The low hum of elite conversation died away as everyone turned to watch the bizarre spectacle unfolding. Julian barked sharp, quiet orders pointing directly to the center of the room. It was the most coveted real estate in the venue, a large open space located directly on the edge of the polished mahogany dance floor, positioned dead center and perfectly aligned with the sweetheart table where Marcus and Chloe sat. Working with astonishing military-like precision, the staff rapidly assembled a brand new seating arrangement right in the middle of the empty space. They set down a massive, gleaming circular table covered in heavy black velvet, a striking contrast to the white silk used for every other guest. They brought in plush, high-backed chairs, adorned with gold trim. Another team of servers rushed in, carrying a breathtaking centerpiece made entirely of deep crimson roses that perfectly matched my gown and my children's accents. They rapidly laid out platinum chargers, crystal glassware, and heavy silver cutlery that far exceeded the quality of the standard place settings. Once the table was flawlessly constructed, Julian turned and practically jogged across the ballroom floor, making a beeline directly for my dark corner. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the highest-ranking hospitality executive in the state approached me, executing a deep apologetic bow. "Ms. Sterling," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the surrounding tables. "Please accept my deepest, most sincere apologies for this catastrophic administrative error. Your proper table is ready. If you and your beautiful children would please follow me." I gave him a gracious, regal nod. "Thank you, Julian. I appreciate your swift attention to this matter." I took Lily's hand, and with Leo and Lance marching perfectly beside us, we followed Julian away from the kitchen doors. We walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, parading past the tables of wealthy politicians, corporate moguls, and gaping family members. The string quartet, unsure of how to react to the disruption, slowly stopped playing altogether. The only sound in the massive room was the confident, rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor. Julian led us directly to the velvet-draped table in the exact center of the room. He pulled out my chair himself, waiting until I was seated before snapping his fingers. 4 servers instantly appeared, pulling out the chairs for my children, treating them with the utmost reverence. A sommelier arrived immediately, pouring a rare vintage sparkling cider into crystal flutes for the kids, and a generous pour of $1,000 Cabernet into my glass. I crossed my legs and looked directly forward. I was now seated less than 30 feet away from Marcus and Chloe, completely dominating their line of sight. They could not look out at their guests without looking directly at me. I raised my heavy crystal glass, locking eyes with my terrified ex-husband. I offered him the exact same slow, mocking toast he had given me just 5 minutes prior. Chloe's mouth was hanging wide open. Her face had turned an alarming shade of pale gray, the heavy bridal makeup completely failing to hide her absolute shock. She looked wildly at the venue staff, silently demanding an explanation as to why the woman she hated most in the world was suddenly receiving royal treatment in the center of her meticulously planned wedding. Marcus was gripping the edge of his sweetheart table so hard his knuckles looked bruised. He was utterly paralyzed, trapped on a stage of his own making, forced to watch the woman he tried to bury claim the absolute center of his world. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air in the room felt suffocating, and I had barely even begun to play my hand. The delicate clinking of silverware against fine china had completely ceased. The grand ballroom, designed to be a monument to Chloe's ultimate victory, had transformed into a theater of her absolute humiliation. From my velvet-draped seat in the center of the room, I watched the reality of the situation violently crash into the new bride. Chloe's chest heaved under her heavy crystal bodice. The diamond necklace that Marcus had undoubtedly financed through another reckless shadow loan sparkled erratically against her flushed, panicked skin. She turned her head, snapping her gaze away from my table and locking it onto her new husband with a look of pure, unadulterated fury. "Marcus!" She hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill intensity that sliced through the ambient murmurs of the room. "You told me she was barren. You swore to me she was a broke, unstable lunatic who dropped off the face of the earth. Who are those children?" Marcus shrank back into his plush chair, completely stripped of his usual magnetic arrogance. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find a lie powerful enough to save him, but his silver tongue failed him. He ran a trembling hand over his face, sweating profusely, ruining the collar of his bespoke shirt. "I do not know, Chloe," he choked out, his voice cracking. "I swear to you, I do not know what she is doing. This is some kind of trick." "A trick?" Chloe slammed her palms down onto the sweetheart table, causing their crystal water goblets to rattle dangerously. The sudden sharp movement drew the immediate attention of the elite guests seated at the front rows. "Are you blind, Marcus? Look at them. They have your face. They have your mother's eyes. They are exactly 5 years old, which means you lied to me from the very beginning. You told me you left her because she was a dead end for this family. You promised me that I would be the one to secure the sterling legacy." Chloe was unraveling rapidly, entirely unable to maintain the poised, graceful facade required of an Atlanta high society bride. For 3 years, she had paraded around the country club, strategically placing herself in the spotlight, boasting about how she was the perfect, fertile replacement for the defective first wife. She had endured Beatrice's overbearing demands and Marcus's hidden financial stress solely because she believed she was investing in a guaranteed lucrative future. Now, sitting at her own wedding reception, she realized she was not the matriarch of a new era. She was merely a placeholder, a temporary distraction while the true heirs were being raised in secret by the very woman she had mocked. The social dynamics in the ballroom were shifting with brutal speed. In circles of extreme wealth, attention is the ultimate currency, and Chloe was currently bankrupt. The influential guests, the politicians, and the corporate moguls were no longer looking at the sweetheart table with admiration. They were looking at it with predatory curiosity. Their eyes continuously darted back and forth between Marcus's terrified face and the 3 miniature flawless versions of him sitting calmly at my VIP table. To make matters worse for the new bride, the venue staff were unconsciously reinforcing the new power structure. Waiters glided past the bridal party, without a second glance, rushing to ensure my children's crystal glasses were constantly filled with sparkling cider. The head chef personally emerged from the kitchen to present a customized, child-friendly gourmet tasting menu to Leo, Lance, and Lily, bowing respectfully before stepping away. The sheer disrespect of the bride being ignored at her own wedding was catastrophic. Beatrice Sterling, sensing the absolute destruction of her family's image, could not remain seated any longer. She abandoned her table of wealthy Heritage Society friends, and Power walked up to the sweetheart table. She leaned over the extravagant floral arrangement, gripping the edge of the table, her face a mask of furious damage control. "Keep your voice down, Chloe," Beatrice ordered in a harsh, desperate whisper, attempting to physically block the guests' view of the arguing couple. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. People are watching. We will deal with that woman and her stage circus later. Right now, you need to smile, pick up your glass, and act like a sterling. For the first time since she had clawed her way into the family, Chloe completely ignored her mother-in-law. She turned her venomous glare onto Beatrice, her perfectly manicured facade shattering into raw, vicious resentment. "Do not tell me to smile, Beatrice!" Chloe snapped, her voice rising loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear clearly. "You promised me an empire. You promised me that if I married your son and gave you a grandson, I would have absolute security. But look right there in the center of the room. Your precious grandsons are already here, and they belong to the woman you told me was penniless. You lied to me. Both of you lied to me." I sat back in my velvet chair, swirling the rich red wine in my glass, watching the foundation of the Sterling family violently crack open. I did not have to say a single word to tear them apart. I simply had to exist. Their entire dynamic was built on greed, status, and deception. The moment that status was threatened, their loyalty to each other evaporated instantly. They were turning on each other like starved animals right in front of the most judgmental audience in the state. The ultimate social insult arrived a moment later. Senator Davis, a man whose political endorsement was the only reason Marcus's latest real estate venture was still breathing, stood up from his seat near the front. He adjusted his jacket and began to walk across the ballroom floor. Chloe immediately straightened her posture, forcing a rigid, desperate smile onto her face, assuming the senator was coming to the sweetheart table to offer his congratulations and diffuse the tension. Marcus stood up slightly, extending a trembling hand to greet him. But Senator Davis did not walk to the sweetheart table. He walked straight past the bride and groom without even a passing glance. He navigated directly to the center of the room and stopped at my table. "Maya," the senator said, his voice booming with genuine warmth and profound respect. "I had heard rumors that Vanguard Horizon was making aggressive moves in the hospitality sector, but I had no idea you were the mastermind behind the curtain. It is an absolute pleasure to finally see you again. And these must be the children." I smiled graciously, offering my hand to the senator. "It is wonderful to see you, Senator Davis. Yes, these are my children, Leo, Lance, and Lily." My 5-year-olds politely nodded to the powerful politician, executing the perfect aristocratic manners I had taught them. The senator chuckled, clearly impressed, before leaning in slightly. "Your firm's recent acquisitions are the talk of the entire financial district, Maya. When you have a moment next week, my office would love to discuss some upcoming urban development initiatives. We need leaders with your kind of ruthless precision." "I would be delighted, Senator," I replied smoothly. "My assistant will reach out on Monday." Senator Davis gave a respectful bow and walked back to his seat, having just publicly endorsed me as the true power in the room. The gesture was not lost on a single person in the ballroom. The political kingmaker of Atlanta had just completely bypassed the Sterling family to pay his respects to the exiled ex-wife. I looked back at the sweetheart table. Chloe was shaking with silent, uncontrollable rage, tears of pure humiliation finally pooling in her eyes. Marcus slumped back into his chair, rubbing his temples, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Beatrice stood frozen behind them, her face ashen, realizing that her family was no longer the apex predator of their social circle. They had become the prey. The elite guests were no longer whispering. They were openly staring, analyzing the collapse of the Sterling dynasty. The first cracks had officially split the family wide open, and I knew with absolute certainty that the entire structure was about to come crashing down. The appetizer course had not even been cleared yet, and they were already destroying themselves from the inside out. I reached over and gently wiped a crumb from Lily's cheek, preparing myself for the next phase of the evening. Marcus was desperate, and desperate men always make the mistake of trying to grab the microphone. The sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback suddenly tore through the suffocating tension of the ballroom. I did not flinch, but several guests winced, covering their ears, as the harsh electronic whine echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Marcus had abandoned his seat at the sweetheart table. He was now standing at the very edge of the elevated stage, gripping a silver microphone so tightly that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. The panicked, desperate groom had decided that the only way to survive the crushing reality of my presence was to completely rewrite the narrative aloud. He signaled the string quartet to stop playing with a frantic, aggressive wave of his hand. The music died instantly. The scattered murmurs of the elite crowd fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Marcus forced a wide, completely unnatural smile onto his face. It was the polished, charismatic mask he used during corporate hostile takeovers, but today the edges of that mask were violently cracking. Sweat glistened on his forehead under the harsh stage lighting. He cleared his throat, adjusting the lapel of his velvet jacket in a desperate bid to project authority. Family, friends, and distinguished guests. Marcus began, his voice booming through the massive speakers, carrying a tremor that he could not quite hide. Thank you all for gathering here today to celebrate this monumental occasion. The Sterling family has always stood as a pillar of strength, integrity, and prosperity in Atlanta. We are a family that honors our legacy above all else. And today I am proud to stand before you as a man who has finally secured that legacy. I sat perfectly still at my velvet-draped table, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I watched him with the mild, detached fascination of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. He was terrified. He was looking everywhere in the room except directly at me. As many of you know, the road to this beautiful moment was not an easy one. Marcus continued, his tone shifting into a practiced, solemn cadence. He was slipping into the role of the tragic hero. 5 years ago, I found myself trapped in a very dark chapter of my life. I was bound to a situation that offered absolutely no future. I was burdened by a partnership defined by inadequacy, instability, and a heartbreaking fundamental failure to move this family forward. A collective, uncomfortable intake of breath swept through the front rows of the audience. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. He was standing 30 feet away from the woman who had just been publicly endorsed by the most powerful senator in the state, calling me an inadequate failure. He was attempting to gaslight a room full of 500 intelligent, powerful people into believing the lie he had sold them half a decade ago. Marcus reached out and pulled Chloe to his side. She stumbled slightly on her massive crystal train but managed to plaster a rigid, haughty smile onto her face. She clung to his arm like a lifeline, desperate to reclaim her position as the triumphant victor. But then out of that darkness, I found Chloe. Marcus declared, raising his voice to a booming crescendo, trying to force the crowd to feel an enthusiasm they clearly lacked. He lifted her hand and pressed a theatrical kiss to her knuckles. She stepped into my life and brought the light back into the Sterling estate. She showed me what a true equal partnership looks like. Chloe is a woman of unparalleled grace, of immaculate class, and of true substance. She understands the heavy weight of our family name. She understands that our legacy requires purity, devotion, and a flawless vision for the future. I glanced over at Beatrice Sterling, who was still standing near the floral archway. The matriarch was not smiling. She had a hand pressed firmly over her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting horror. Unlike her arrogant son, Beatrice was highly observant. She could see the expressions on the faces of the judges, the investors, and the socialites. She knew that Marcus's speech was not saving them. It was digging their graves 10 feet deeper. Marcus was entirely blind to the room's actual temperature. He was intoxicated by the sound of his own voice, completely high on his own delusion. He took a step closer to the edge of the stage, his gaze finally snapping directly toward my table. The fear in his eyes had briefly mutated into a reckless, cornered aggression. We are gathered here tonight, not just to celebrate a marriage, but to celebrate the undisputed future of this dynasty. Marcus projected, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Chloe is the woman who will finally give this family exactly what it deserves. She is the one who will bear the true worthy heirs of the Sterling bloodline. She will give me children raised with our values, our integrity, and our undisputed pedigree. We will not be distracted by desperate illusions today. We will not entertain pathetic, staged attempts for attention from those who spectacularly failed to measure up. The past is entirely dead. The true future of the Sterling family is standing right beside me. He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air, expecting the room to erupt into thunderous, validating applause. He expected the elite crowd to raise their glasses to cheer for his beautiful new bride, and to socially execute me right there in the center of the ballroom. Absolutely no one clapped. The silence that followed his grand declaration was so profound, so heavy, and so painfully awkward that it physically suffocated the room. A few polite scattered claps came from Chloe's immediate family members in the back, but they quickly died out when they realized no one else was joining them. The influential guest simply stared at Marcus as if he had entirely lost his mind. The cognitive dissonance he had just forced upon the crowd was spectacularly jarring. He was standing on a stage proudly boasting that his new wife would one day provide him with true worthy heirs. Yet sitting directly in the center of the room, illuminated by the grand chandelier, were three flawless 5-year-old replicas of his own face. They were sitting quietly, eating their gourmet meals with impeccable aristocratic manners, serving as living, breathing monuments to his absolute hypocrisy. Leo placed his silver fork down on his porcelain plate. He looked up at the stage, his hazel eyes narrowing slightly in childish confusion. He leaned over to me, tugging gently on the sleeve of my crimson gown. His voice, clear and innocent, carried remarkably well in the dead silent ballroom. Mommy, Leo asked, tilting his head. Why is that sweaty man yelling about a dynasty? Did he forget his medicine? A sharp, unmistakable snort of laughter erupted from a nearby table. I glanced over and saw Liam Marcus's brother-in-law covering his mouth with a linen napkin, his shoulders shaking as he desperately tried to conceal his amusement. Several other guests quickly raised their glasses to their faces, hiding their own appalled smiles behind their champagne. Marcus's outstretched arm, still holding his glass high in the air, began to visibly tremble. The utter lack of applause hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The triumphant smirk on Chloe's face melted into a twisted grimace of pure, agonizing humiliation. They were standing on a stage of their own design, bathed in a spotlight they had paid for, and they were drowning in a sea of public pity and profound disrespect. Marcus had just handed me the greatest gift I could have ever asked for. He had demanded the attention of the entire room. He had commanded everyone to look at the past, to look at the present, and to look at the future of the Sterling family. He had set the stage perfectly, handing me the absolute justification to finish this war once and for all. I smoothly reached down and picked up my matching crimson clutch. I slowly stood up from my plush, high-backed velvet chair. The rustle of my heavy silk gown was the only sound in the room. As I rose to my full height, every single eye in the grand ballroom snapped away from the sweaty, panicking groom on the stage and locked entirely onto me. Marcus had taken his turn at the microphone to spin a desperate, pathetic fantasy. It was now my turn to introduce Atlanta high society to the cold, undeniable, and utterly devastating reality. I stepped away from the velvet-draped table, my crimson silk gown gliding across the polished marble floor. The distance between my seat and the elevated stage was perhaps 40 feet, but I stretched every single inch of it into a masterclass in psychological warfare. The crowd of elite politicians, wealthy investors, and high society matriarchs parted from me instantly. No one dared to breathe. The only sound in the massive ballroom was the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels counting down the final seconds of Marcus Sterling's fabricated life. As I reached the bottom of the stage stairs, Chloe shrank backward. She clutched the heavy tool of her wedding dress, her knuckles turning bone white, pressing herself against the floral archway as if she could simply melt into the decorations and disappear. She looked absolutely terrified. The triumphant, arrogant bride from 10 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a cornered, panicking woman who suddenly realized she had bought a ticket on a sinking ship. I ascended the stairs, slowly, deliberately, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Marcus. He was trembling violently now. The slick corporate confidence he used to charm venture capitalists had evaporated entirely. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train bear down on him, completely incapable of moving his feet. When I reached the center of the stage, I stopped less than 2 feet away from him. He smelled of expensive cologne and sour, unmistakable fear. He was still clutching the silver microphone, holding it like a life preserver. I reached out and wrapped my fingers over his. For a fraction of a second, his grip tightened, a pathetic primal reflex to maintain control. I tilted my head, offering him a smile made of pure ice, and raised a single eyebrow. His resistance shattered instantly. His hand went entirely limp, and I smoothly pulled the microphone from his sweating palms. I turned my back to him, facing the sprawling sea of Atlanta's most powerful families. The blinding stage lights washed over me, but I did not blink. I stood perfectly straight, commanding the room with a terrifying ease that Marcus could never hope to possess. Distinguished guests. I began, my voice echoing crystal clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the front rows, making deliberate eye contact with Senator Davis, then Liam, and finally resting on the horrified face of Beatrice Sterling. I would like to sincerely thank Marcus for his incredibly passionate speech. He has always had a flair for the dramatic, but tonight I find myself agreeing with him on a fundamental level. A ripple of extreme confusion swept through the audience. Marcus let out a ragged, trembling breath behind me, clearly terrified of where I was taking this. Marcus is absolutely right, I continued, my tone smooth, melodic, and devastatingly reasonable. The Sterling family legacy is not something that should be taken lightly. A dynasty of this magnitude cannot survive on cheap illusions, shadow loans, or desperate social climbing. It requires absolute authenticity. It requires a flawless vision. And most importantly, as the groom just so eloquently stated, it requires true worthy heirs. I began to slowly pace the length of the stage, owning the space completely. 5 years ago, Marcus made a critical investment decision. He was advised by certain individuals in this very room that his portfolio was being weighed down by a bad asset. He was told that his bloodline was in jeopardy. So he cut his losses. He liquidated his marriage in search of a more profitable, fertile future. He told the entire city of Atlanta that he was forced to walk away from a barren woman for the sake of the Sterling name. I stopped pacing and stood dead center, my voice dropping into a register of undeniable, chilling authority. But the fundamental rule of high finance, and indeed of life, is that you must always verify your assets before you sign the contract. Marcus did not verify his. He acted out of arrogance, impatience, and profound ignorance. And because of that catastrophic miscalculation, he blindly threw away the exact legacy he was so desperate to protect. I pointed down to the center of the ballroom, directing the attention of every single guest to the velvet table where my 3 children sat. You see, I did not come here today to ruin a celebration. I projected, my voice ringing with absolute power. I came here to deliver a long overdue introduction. Atlanta high society values pedigree above all else, so it is only right that you formally meet the absolute future of this dynasty. I looked down at Leo, Lance, and Lily. I gave them a subtle confirming nod. My children, trained with impeccable aristocratic discipline, immediately stood up from their high-backed velvet chairs. They did not fidget. They did not look nervous. They smoothed their custom-tailored suits and silk dresses, acting with a level of poise that put every adult in the room to shame. They looked up at the stage, their striking hazel eyes locking directly onto the terrified, sweating man standing behind me. In perfect, chilling unison, their clear, angelic voices rang out across the dead, silent ballroom. "Hello, Father Marcus." The words were spoken with ultimate politeness, yet they hit the room like a tactical nuclear strike. The grand ballroom instantly violently erupted. The aristocratic decorum of the Atlanta elite completely shattered into pure, unadulterated chaos. It was an explosion of gasps, shouts, and frantic whispering. Every single guest was on their feet. The flashes of dozens of smartphone cameras lit up the room like a strobe light, capturing the complete and utter destruction of the Sterling family empire in high definition. Behind me, Chloe let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream. The sound tore through the air, raw and devastating. Her knees buckled under the weight of her massive crystal gown, and she collapsed onto the floor of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands, her immaculate makeup smearing across her diamond necklace, realizing that her entire life, her marriage, her status, and her future was an absolute, irredeemable lie. Down on the floor, Beatrice Sterling clutched her chest, violently gasping for air. The matriarch who had orchestrated my removal 5 years ago looked as though she was having a heart attack. She staggered forward, knocking over a chair, her eyes completely wild with horror. She tried to walk toward the stage, trying to scream my name, but her legs entirely gave out. She collapsed into the arms of a nearby waiter, hyperventilating her perfectly manicured world, burning to ashes around her. Marcus did not move to help his mother. He did not drop down to comfort his hysterical new bride. He backed away from me, his eyes wide and vacant, retreating, until his spine hit the hard marble wall of the stage backdrop. He slid down the wall, his hands pulling at his own hair, his breathing rapid and shallow. The arrogant, untouchable corporate air had been reduced to a whimpering, paralyzed coward. He stared down at his 3 flawless children, the undeniable proof of his monumental failure, completely unable to process the magnitude of what he had lost. I stood at the edge of the stage, the microphone hanging loosely from my fingers, watching the chaotic, spectacular ruin of the people who had tried to bury me. The shouting, the flashing cameras, the weeping bride, and the suffocating panic of the groom created a symphony of absolute justice. I had promised my children that we would be the most important guests at this event. I had delivered on that promise, and the Sterling family was finally paying the ultimate devastating price for their arrogance. The deafening silence that had paralyzed the ballroom was suddenly shattered by a visceral, ear-piercing shriek. Chloe scrambled up from the marble floor, her heavy crystal gown tangling around her legs, making her look like a frantic trapped bird. The elegant, triumphant bride from earlier was completely gone. Her immaculate makeup was smeared with tears of rage and humiliation, dark mascara streaking down her cheeks. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me, then down at the 3 children seated calmly in the center of the room. "You are a liar!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking, as she desperately tried to claw back control of her shattered reality. "A pathetic, desperate liar. You hired these children. You found orphans who look like him just to ruin my perfect day. You are trying to sabotage my marriage because you are jealous. I demand a DNA test right now. I want a paternity test to prove you are nothing but a fraud." I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply looked down at this frantic woman, noting the way her heavy gown now looked like a burdensome cage. "Chloe," I said smoothly, my voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "A DNA test will only prove what every intelligent person in this room already knows. But if you want to waste your time confirming the absolute obvious, be my guest. However, a blood test will not magically fix your marriage. It will not erase the fact that your new husband built your entire relationship on a foundation of monumental lies." Before Chloe could unleash another hysterical scream, Beatrice Sterling finally found her footing. The matriarch pushed away the waiter who had caught her, her chest heaving as she stormed back toward the stage. She bypassed her paralyzed son entirely, marching right up to the edge of the elevated platform to glare up at me. Her face was contorted with a vicious, desperate fury. She had realized that Chloe's frantic denial was useless, so she immediately pivoted to her oldest, most familiar weapon: character assassination. "Extortion!" Beatrice roared, pointing her manicured finger at me like a weapon. "That is what this is. This is a calculated, malicious extortion plot. You hid my grandchildren from me for 5 years for this exact moment. You waited until my son was highly successful, until he was entering the prime of his corporate career, so you could show up and blackmail him for millions in back child support. You are nothing but a scheming, manipulative gold digger trying to drain the Sterling family accounts." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, but the elite guests were no longer looking at me with disdain. They were looking at Beatrice with profound skepticism. The wealthy matriarchs and corporate titans in the audience were highly observant people. They were looking at my custom crimson silk gown, the flawless tailoring of my children's suits, and the massive diamonds resting against my collarbone. The math of Beatrice's accusations simply did not add up, and I was about to provide them with the exact receipts to prove it. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made Beatrice take a hesitant step backward. I raised my hand, signaling the audio-visual booth located at the back of the venue. Because I currently owned the parent company of the hospitality group, The venue staff worked for me, not the Sterling family. Within seconds, the massive LED screens flanking the stage, which had previously been displaying a romantic curated slideshow of Marcus and Chloe's engagement photos, suddenly cut to pitch black. The abrupt shift in lighting caused the entire room to murmur in anticipation. Then a single highly detailed document flashed onto the massive screens in brilliant high definition. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the screens. Beatrice, I projected, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the vast ballroom. You claim I am a gold digger. You claim I hid these children to extort your son. Let us examine the timeline of your profound delusion. The document on the screen was a certified medical record. It displayed an ultrasound image of 3 tiny embryos accompanied by official laboratory results. I highlighted the date at the top of the screen. This medical record is dated exactly 5 years ago. I stated, my tone sharp and unyielding. It is dated the exact same morning you and Marcus threw me out of your house. I walked out of your front doors carrying this exact piece of paper in my purse. You called me a dead tree. You told Marcus to cut his losses because I was a bad investment. You did not even bother to wait for the secondary specialist's results before you moved your mistress into my home. The crowd erupted into furious, shocked whispering. The elite circles of Atlanta placed immense value on family loyalty, and Beatrice's ruthless, hasty cruelty was now being broadcast for all to see. Marcus flinched against the wall, squeezing his eyes shut, as the reality of his monumental impatience was laid bare. I did not hide your grandchildren from you, Beatrice. I continued, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. You threw us away. You made it abundantly clear that my presence in your family was conditional on a medical diagnosis that you did not even have the basic decency to verify. I simply accepted your terms and removed myself and my children from your toxic, superficial environment. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, mottled red. That does not change what you are doing now, she countered desperately, clinging to her false narrative. You are here to demand a payout. You want sterling money. You want to drain my son's bank accounts to fund your lifestyle. I let out a harsh, genuinely amused laugh. It echoed through the microphone, startling the guests. I raised my hand again. The massive LED screens shifted instantly. The medical records vanished, replaced by a series of redacted, highly authenticated financial statements and corporate portfolio summaries. I want you to look very closely at these numbers, Beatrice, I commanded. These are the certified financial records of Vanguard Horizon, my venture capital firm. Look at the annual revenue. Look at the asset acquisition history. Look at the absolute, undeniable proof of my independence. The guests in the front rows, including Senator Davis and several prominent investment bankers, visibly leaned forward, their eyes widening as they read the staggering figures displayed on the screens. The numbers were astronomical, completely dwarfing the known net worth of the Sterling family's traditional real estate and tech ventures. I have never needed a single cent of your money, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. I paid for every doctor's appointment. I paid for every hospital bill. I paid for the elite private tutors, the custom wardrobes, and the sprawling estate my children currently live in. I built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up, while your son was busy losing your family's capital on failed tech startups and excessive country club dues. I looked down at Marcus, who was still slumped against the marble backdrop of the stage, breathing heavily, completely destroyed by the irrefutable evidence of my success. I am not here for child support, Marcus, I said, addressing him directly. I am not here for alimony. I am not here to extort a single dime from your dwindling, pathetic bank accounts. My children have never needed your financial support because their mother is a titan. Beatrice staggered backward, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of my wealth completely obliterated her only defense. She had spent 5 years convincing herself that she had discarded a weak, dependent woman. Now she was staring at a self-made billionaire who had absolutely no need for the Sterling name. Chloe remained on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, clutching her ruined crystal gown, finally understanding that the wealthy, powerful husband she thought she had secured was nothing compared to the woman standing above them. The ballroom was entirely captivated. The narrative had been violently ripped from the Sterling family's hands and rewritten with cold, hard facts. I had dismantled their lies, exposed their cruelty, and proved my absolute financial supremacy in front of the most influential audience in the state. But I was not finished. The financial records on the screen were merely the prologue. I had proven that I did not need their money, but I had yet to reveal the most devastating truth of all. I was about to prove that Marcus had no legal right to claim my children, and more importantly, that he had no legal right to claim his own family empire. I raised my hand toward the back of the room one more time. The massive LED screens flanking the stage flashed, wiping away the staggering financial records of my venture capital firm. The bright white glow of a scanned legal document illuminated the faces of the terrified bride and groom. I did not project a birth certificate. I projected a heavily stamped notarized divorce decree. This document was finalized exactly 5 years ago, I announced, letting my voice ring with a terrifying clarity. It was drafted by the most expensive divorce attorneys in Atlanta. Your attorneys, Marcus. You paid them a truly obscene amount of money to expedite our separation because you were in such a desperate, frantic rush to clear the way for your new mistress. Marcus stared at the glowing screens. His eyes darted across the dense legal jargon, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He did not remember what was in that paperwork. He had been too arrogant, too blinded by his own ego to actually read the fine print of the severance he was forcing upon me. You wanted a clean break, Marcus, I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. You explicitly instructed your legal team to draft an airtight agreement that severed every possible tie between us. You wanted to ensure that the barren, useless woman you were discarding could never come back to lay claim to your future wealth. You were so terrified that I might ask for a fraction of your real estate portfolio that you signed everything they put in front of you without a second thought. I gestured to the screens, and a specific section of the document was suddenly magnified, highlighted in a bright, unmistakable yellow box. I drew the crowd's attention to Section 4, Paragraph B. Read it out loud, Marcus. Read the exact terms of the exit strategy you were so incredibly proud of. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips trembled violently. He was physically incapable of reading the words that were currently sealing his fate. Since the groom has suddenly lost his voice, I will read it for him, I said, my tone dripping with lethal precision. It states, and I quote, Marcus Sterling voluntarily and irrevocably relinquishes any and all parental rights, claims custody, and legal responsibilities to any existing or future biological material embryos or offspring conceived during the tenure of this marriage. Furthermore, Marcus Sterling permanently surrenders all rights to contest paternity or seek guardianship of any such offspring in the future. A collective gasp echoed across the grand ballroom. The influential politicians, judges, and corporate titans in the audience instantly grasped the devastating legal magnitude of that paragraph. Marcus let out a guttural, panicked sound. That is not legal, he choked out, his voice cracking wildly. I did not know you were pregnant. You cannot hold me to a clause about children I did not know existed. That is fraud, Maya. You committed fraud. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through his pathetic defense. It is not fraud, Marcus. It is a binding legal contract that your own highly paid attorneys drafted, reviewed, and filed with the state of Georgia. You signed away your rights to any existing biological material. You were so absolutely certain that I was infertile, so completely convinced by your mother's chosen doctor, that you treated that clause like a meaningless formality. You legally severed yourself from my womb because you wanted to make absolutely sure you would never have to pay a dime of child support if a miracle ever occurred. I turned slightly, casting my gaze toward Liam, who was still standing in the crowd. Liam, as a highly respected corporate and family attorney, perhaps you could clarify the legality of this document for your brother-in-law. Liam did not hesitate. He looked directly at the stage, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. The document is ironclad, Marcus. You signed a voluntary, irrevocable surrender of rights. It does not matter if you knew she was pregnant at the time. You willingly forfeited any legal claim to her existing offspring. In the eyes of the law, you are not a father. You are nothing more than a biological sperm donor who relinquished his rights 5 years ago. Marcus stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the marble wall behind the stage. He looked completely destroyed. The reality of his own arrogance had finally caught up to him. He had permanently stripped himself of fatherhood. But the sheer legal brilliance of the document went far beyond child custody, and Beatrice Sterling suddenly realized it. The matriarch let out a horrified, strangled gasp from the floor below. Her hands flew to her head, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place as the full catastrophic picture clicked into place in her mind. "You gave them away!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice tearing through the ballroom. She pointed a shaking, furious finger up at her son. "You signed away the only legitimate heirs to this family. You complete and utter fool. Do you have any idea what you have done?" Beatrice scrambled forward, grabbing the edge of the stage. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate pivot. The vicious, condescending woman from 10 minutes ago vanished, replaced by a panicked, groveling beggar. "Maya, please," Beatrice pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured warmth. "We are a family. Those are my grandchildren. They have sterling blood running through their veins. They belong with us. We can tear that document up. We can work this out. I will give you whatever you want. We will welcome you back. We will give the children the legacy they deserve." I stared down at the woman who had once called me a dead tree, a woman who had tried to banish me to the shadows and erase my very existence. The sheer repulsive hypocrisy of her sudden affection made my stomach turn. "They do not belong to you, Beatrice," I stated, my voice freezing the air around her. "They do not have sterling blood. They have my blood. They have my resilience, my intellect, and my strength. You do not get to throw a pregnant woman onto the street like garbage and then beg for a second chance when you realize she is carrying gold. You will never have a relationship with my children. You will never be a grandmother to them. You will never see them, speak to them, or claim them. They are completely and legally untouchable to you." Chloe, who had been weeping silently on the floor of the stage, suddenly looked up. Her tear-streaked face was a mask of absolute horror as she finally comprehended the magnitude of Marcus's ruin. She had endured years of Beatrice's psychological abuse. She had tolerated Marcus's financial instability, and she had staked her entire future on the promise that she would be the mother of the next sterling billionaire. Now she realized that Marcus was not just broke. He was legally severed from the true heirs, meaning he had absolutely no leverage left in his own family trust. "You have nothing," Chloe whispered, her voice hollow and dead. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of profound disgust and pure hatred. "You have absolutely nothing. You are a broke, pathetic liar who gave away his own children to marry a woman you cannot even afford to support." Marcus tried to reach out to her, his hand shaking violently. "Chloe, please," he begged. "We can fix this. We will have our own children. We will build our own legacy." "With what money?" Chloe screamed, scrambling to her feet and backing away from him as if he were diseased. "Your mother's accounts are dry. Your investments are underwater. The only thing of value this family has left is the trust fund, and you just proved to 500 people that you gave away the only heirs who could secure it." I watched the glorious, spectacular collapse of the Sterling dynasty with absolute satisfaction. Chloe had unwittingly laid the perfect groundwork for my final fatal blow. She was absolutely right about the trust fund, but she was entirely wrong about who currently controlled it. I had proven my wealth, and I had proven my exclusive legal rights to my children. There was only one final piece of the empire left to claim, and I was about to drop the guillotine on the Sterling family's very existence. "You are remarkably perceptive for a woman who just threw her entire future away," I said, looking down at Chloe's tear-streaked face. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the cold reality of my words sink into the silent ballroom. "You are absolutely right. The trust fund is the only thing of actual value this family has left. But you are operating under a massive, fatal misconception about who actually owns it." I turned away from the weeping bride and looked directly out into the crowd. The 500 elite guests were sitting on the edge of their seats, completely mesmerized by the absolute dismantling of the Sterling Empire. In circles of generational wealth, trust funds were sacred. They were the impenetrable vaults that protected old money from reckless heirs, bad investments, and greedy spouses. Marcus's grandfather was a very paranoid, very traditional man. I projected my voice echoing through the grand space. He built the sterling fortune from the ground up, and he knew exactly how easily a lazy, entitled subsequent generation could squander it. So when he established the Sterling Family Trust, he did not just hand the keys over to his children or his grandchildren. He locked the kingdom behind a very specific, unbreakable legal door. I looked over at Liam, who was standing near the front row, watching me with a look of profound, quiet respect. He was not just Marcus's brother-in-law. He was a senior partner at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Georgia, and he knew the Sterling family's legal framework better than Marcus ever did. Liam, I requested, gesturing gracefully toward the stage. Would you do me the honor of joining me up here? I believe the guests deserve to hear the exact terms of the trust from a completely neutral, impeccably credentialed officer of the court. Beatrice let out a strangled, terrified gasp. She lunged forward, grabbing Liam's arm as he stepped into the aisle. Liam, do not you dare! She hissed, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. You are a part of this family. You are married to my daughter. You will not help this woman destroy us. Liam slowly turned his head and looked down at his mother-in-law. He gently but firmly detached her manicured fingers from his suit jacket. Beatrice, I am a lawyer before I am your son-in-law, Liam replied, his Midwestern baritone carrying an absolute, uncompromising integrity. And quite frankly, I am entirely exhausted from covering up the financial incompetence of this family. Maya has every right to the truth, and so do the investors sitting in this room. He left Beatrice hyperventilating in the aisle and walked up the marble steps of the stage. He did not look at Marcus, who was still slumped against the back wall, staring blankly ahead. Liam pulled his phone from his inner breast pocket and opened a highly secured legal file. He stepped up to the microphone, his towering presence commanding immediate silence. As the acting secondary trustee and legal counsel for the extended family, I can confirm the stipulations of the Sterling Trust, Liam announced, his voice booming with courtroom authority. Marcus's grandfather implemented a strict generational wealth preservation clause. Under Section 8, Paragraph C, the core rule of the trust is explicitly defined. Control of the primary estate and its yielding assets does not belong to the third generation. It legally belongs exclusively to the fourth generation of the Sterling bloodline. A loud collective murmur swept through the ballroom. The wealthy patriarchs and politicians in the crowd immediately understood the brilliant, ruthless mechanism of that rule. Liam raised a hand to quiet the crowd, reading directly from the legal document on his screen. Marcus and my wife Nia, as the third generation, are only legally entitled to a modest annual living stipend. The principal empire, the corporate holdings, the real estate portfolio, and the massive liquid assets are completely locked. They only unlock and vest into full control when the fourth generation is born and legally recognized. Until the fourth generation reaches the age of 25, total conservatorship of the multi-billion-dollar trust is granted to their sole legal guardian. Marcus suddenly scrambled up from the floor. His face was a mask of absolute, unhinged panic. He rushed toward Liam, pointing a shaking finger down at the velvet table where Leo, Lance, and Lily were sitting. "But they are my blood," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking violently over the microphone. "You all see them. They are my biological children. They are the fourth generation. That means I am their father. I get the conservatorship. The trust belongs to me." Liam did not step back. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He lowered his phone and shook his head slowly. "Blood is not enough in the eyes of the law." Marcus Liam stated, his words striking like the fatal blow of a hammer. "The trust specifically and explicitly mandates legally recognized heirs. It requires documented lawful parentage." Liam turned and gestured toward the massive LED screens that were still displaying the heavily notarized divorce decree. 5 years ago, you signed a voluntary, irrevocable surrender of all parental rights to any existing biological material or offspring. Liam explained, translating the dense legal jargon into a brutal, undeniable reality. You legally orphaned your own children before they were even born. In the eyes of the state of Georgia, and more importantly in the eyes of the Sterling Family Trust, you have absolutely zero legal connection to those 3 children. You are not their father. You are a biological stranger. Marcus staggered backward as if he had been physically shot. He clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately tried to draw air into his collapsing lungs. The sheer catastrophic magnitude of his own arrogance had finally caught up to him. He had been so terrified of paying child support, so eager to impress his new mistress, that he had willingly signed away his only key to the family fortune. Because you have no legally recognized heirs with Chloe, and because you legally severed yourself from Maya's children, you have failed to produce the 4th generation. Liam continued delivering the final devastating verdict. Therefore, the trust bypasses you completely. The entire Sterling Empire vests immediately and exclusively into the 3 children seated at that table. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint rustle of the silk tablecloths. And because Maya is the sole legal parent and guardian of the only recognized 4th generation heirs, Liam concluded, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Total undisputed conservatorship of the Sterling Family Trust immediately transfers to her. She controls every property, every corporate asset, and every single bank account. You are left with absolutely nothing, Marcus. A heavy, suffocating weight dropped over the stage. Marcus fell to his knees. The sharp-polished groom who had commanded the room 20 minutes earlier was gone. He pressed his forehead against the cold marble floor, letting out a raw, agonizing sob of pure defeat. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his children, and now he had officially lost every single penny of his family's legacy. Chloe let out a dark, hysterical laugh from the corner of the stage. She ripped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat, the clasp breaking and sending a shower of jewels scattering across the floor. She realized that she had wasted the best years of her life fighting to marry a man who was now legally and financially obsolete. I stood at the center of the stage, looking out at the stunned faces of Atlanta's elite. I had not just crashed a wedding, I had executed a hostile takeover of a dynasty in plain sight. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a tantrum. I had used their own rules, their own contracts, and their own elitist clauses to systematically dismantle their entire existence. The Sterling name no longer belonged to Beatrice or Marcus. It belonged to my children, and I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Liam cleared his throat, bringing the microphone closer to his mouth. The subtle, sharp sound of audio feedback snapped the grand ballroom out of its stunned paralysis. He adjusted his posture, his expression shifting from a disappointed relative to a ruthless corporate attorney executing a flawless legal maneuver. He was not finished, and the businessmen in the room could sense the impending shift in the corporate atmosphere. To be absolutely clear for the board members and corporate stakeholders in attendance tonight, Liam projected his Midwestern baritone, cutting through the heavy silence. This is not simply a matter of personal bank accounts or residential real estate. The Sterling Family Trust holds exactly 80% of the voting shares in Sterling Enterprises. It is the primary controlling entity of the entire corporate portfolio. A new distinct wave of shock crashed through the audience. The high society gossip instantly morphed into sheer financial panic. Several men in expensive tuxedos, the very investors and board members who had been drinking Marcus's champagne just an hour ago, physically stiffened. Some immediately reached into their breast pockets to pull out their phones, rapidly typing messages to their brokers and legal teams. In the cutthroat world of Atlanta's elite business district, a shift in 80% of voting shares was an absolute earthquake. Liam turned his gaze down to my 3 children, who were still sitting with perfect, unbothered posture at the velvet table. Because Marcus legally severed his rights 5 years ago, and because there are no other documented heirs, Leo, Lance, and Lily are the only legitimate 4th-generation heirs in existence. They are the sole beneficiaries of the trust. Liam then looked directly at Marcus, delivering the final suffocating blow. And because minors cannot exercise corporate voting rights, total control of that 80% stake defaults entirely to their sole legal guardian. Maya is now the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises. She controls the board, she controls the assets, she controls the company. Marcus pushed himself off the marble wall, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. "I am the Chief Executive Officer," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking horribly. "I built the recent expansions. I hold the operational title. The board of directors will never allow an outsider to simply walk in and take over the company I run." I did not let Liam answer him. I took a deliberate step forward, my crimson silk gown brushing against the stage floor. I looked down at the sweating, panicked man who had once thought he could easily replace me. "You do not run anything anymore, Marcus," I said, my voice dripping with absolute authority. "An executive title is nothing but a temporary name tag provided by the people who actually own the building. You are an employee. And as of this exact moment, you are an employee who has spectacularly mismanaged my children's future inheritance." I turned my attention to the front rows of the audience, locking eyes with Elias Montgomery, the senior chairman of the Sterling Enterprises board. Elias was a shrewd, calculating man who valued profit above all forms of loyalty. He had watched this entire spectacle unfold with a terrifyingly neutral expression. "Elias," I called out smoothly, addressing the chairman directly, "I expect a comprehensive, unredacted audit of all corporate accounts to be sitting on my desk at Vanguard Horizon by 8 o'clock Monday morning. We are going to conduct a massive restructuring of the executive team. I will not tolerate a CEO who leverages company assets to fund his personal country club memberships and extravagant fraudulent weddings." Elias Montgomery did not hesitate. He did not look at Marcus for permission. He stood up from his seat, buttoned his tailored jacket, and gave me a deep, respectful nod. "You will have the files first thing Monday morning, Ms. Sterling. We look forward to your leadership." Marcus let out a ragged, agonizing gasp. The betrayal of his own board chairman hit him harder than a physical strike. He turned wildly toward the other executives scattered throughout the crowd, silently begging for anyone to defend him. Not a single man met his eye. The corporate titans of Atlanta were sharks, and they could smell the blood in the water. They instantly aligned themselves with the true power in the room, seamlessly abandoning the sinking ship that was Marcus's career. Beatrice Sterling, realizing that her son's corporate shield had just evaporated, stumbled forward. She grabbed the edge of the stage, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The wealthy matriarch finally understood the catastrophic reality of her new existence. The trust did not just control the company, it controlled her entire life. "You cannot do this!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant sting. "You cannot take my home. You cannot take my livelihood. I am the matriarch of this family." I looked down at the woman who had mercilessly orchestrated my lowest moment. I felt absolutely no pity for her. "You are the matriarch of a dynasty that no longer belongs to you, Beatrice." I kept my tone terrifyingly polite. "That sprawling estate you live in, the title is held by the trust. The vehicles you drive leased by the trust. Your generous monthly allowance dispersed entirely by the trust." I leaned down slightly, making sure my words pierced directly through her panic. "You threw me out onto the street 5 years ago because you thought I was a bad investment. You told me I had no place in your pristine house. Well, Beatrice, you are now officially living in my house. You are driving my cars. You are existing entirely on my payroll. If I decide to freeze your discretionary funds tomorrow, you will not even be able to afford the valet tip at your precious Heritage Society luncheons." Beatrice let out a weak, strangled cry. Her legs gave out completely, and she slumped onto the marble floor, her expensive pearls clattering against the stone. She covered her face with her trembling hands, realizing that her survival now depended entirely on the mercy of the woman she had tried to destroy. She was entirely at my mercy, and she knew I had none to give her. On the other side of the stage, Chloe had finally seen enough. The illusion of her grand, wealthy future had been violently torn to shreds, leaving behind a broke, unemployed, legally humiliated groom. The fierce, calculating ambition that had driven her to steal another woman's husband now commanded her to abandon him. Chloe stood up from the floor, kicking the heavy, restrictive fabric of her crystal bridal gown out of her way. She did not look at Marcus with sadness. She looked at him with pure, venomous disgust. She reached up and unclasped the massive diamond necklace from her throat, dropping it carelessly onto the stage. It hit the marble with a dull, heavy thud. "I am completely done!" Chloe spat, her voice echoing into the microphone that still stood near the center of the stage. "You are a broke, pathetic liar. You have nothing. You are nothing. I would rather walk out of here barefoot than spend another single second pretending to be your wife." Marcus reached out to her, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "Chloe, please. We are married. We took vows. We signed a piece of paper that I am going to have annulled by tomorrow afternoon," Chloe fired back ruthlessly. She gathered the massive skirts of her wedding gown in her hands and turned her back on him. She marched down the stairs, shoving past the stunned guests, her face set in a furious, humiliating scowl. She marched straight out the grand double doors of the ballroom, abandoning her own spectacular wedding reception without a single backward glance. Marcus was left entirely alone on the stage. His mother was weeping on the floor below him. His bride had just publicly deserted him. His brother-in-law had executed his legal ruin. His board of directors had pledged allegiance to his ex-wife. He slowly slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, burying his face in his hands. The confident golden child of the Sterling family had been completely and systematically stripped of his wealth, his power, his title, and his pride. I stood above him, bathed in the brilliant light of the chandeliers, feeling the intoxicating absolute weight of total victory. I had not laid a single hand on him. I had simply stepped into the light and let the truth incinerate his entire world. The transfer of power was complete. I was no longer the discarded ex-wife. I was the undisputed ruler of the Sterling Empire. At the back of the grand ballroom, right before crossing the threshold into the opulent foyer, Chloe suddenly froze. The massive double doors were held open by terrified venue staff, but she refused to take that final step out into the night. She slowly turned back to face the stage. Even from a distance, I could see the furious calculation burning in her eyes. Liam had just publicly laid out the brutal, uncompromising terms of the Sterling family trust. Chloe was a highly ambitious woman, and she had just fully processed the terrifying reality that marrying Marcus would not grant her access to a billion-dollar empire. It would legally chain her to a disgraced, unemployed man drowning in hidden debt. She looked down at her left hand, holding it up so the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers caught the massive multi-carat Sterling family heirloom diamond sitting on her ring finger. It was the ring Beatrice had proudly boasted about in every society magazine, the ring that was supposed to symbolize Chloe's elevation to the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta wealth. Now it was nothing more than a glaring, heavy reminder of a fraudulent promise. With a sneer that twisted her beautiful features into a mask of pure venom, Chloe wrenched the diamond off her finger. She did not hand it to a bridesmaid. She did not place it gracefully on a table. She cocked her arm back and threw it with all the strength she possessed directly toward the stage. The heavy platinum and diamond ring sailed through the tense, suffocating air of the ballroom. It struck the polished marble steps just below the elevated platform with a sharp, violent crack that made several guests physically jump in their seats. The ring bounced and spun erratically before finally rolling to a dead stop mere inches from Marcus's polished leather shoes. "The wedding is permanently off, Marcus." Chloe projected her voice, carrying a lethal, uncompromising finality that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "You can take this fake, worthless legacy and choke on it. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. I am completely done with you and this pathetic, bankrupt family." She spun around, grabbed the remaining tool of her ruined gown, and marched out into the foyer. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind her with a booming, hollow thud that sounded exactly like the closing of a vault. Marcus stared blindly down at the discarded engagement ring resting against his shoe. It was the ultimate glaring symbol of his absolute failure. The room was so dead silent that the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing amplified through the microphone still lying on the stage. His mother was incapacitated, weeping on the floor below him. His bride had publicly deserted him in front of the entire city. His company, his trust fund, and his entire future were securely locked inside my corporate portfolio. He was entirely stripped of his armor. The reality of his irreversible destruction crashed down on him, crushing whatever rational corporate composure he had left. I watched the despair in his eyes rapidly warp into something entirely feral. The shock dissolved, replaced by a blinding, unadulterated and primal rage. He looked up from the ring and locked eyes with me. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of violent fury, his veins bulging against his neck. The man who had spent his entire life hiding behind wealth, privilege, and expensive lawyers had finally been backed into a corner, and his reaction was pure reckless aggression. "You took everything from me!" Marcus screamed, his voice breaking into a manic, guttural roar that terrified the front rows of the audience. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the slipping fabric of his tailored velvet jacket. He lunged forward, charging directly at me with his hands outstretched. He intended to physically tear me down from the pedestal I had just claimed, entirely willing to commit violent assault in front of 500 of the most powerful people in the state of Georgia. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still, my chin held high because I knew I was the safest woman in the entire building. Before Marcus could even clear the short distance across the stage, the shadows of the ballroom violently came alive. My professional security detail, a highly trained elite extraction and protection team I had stationed discreetly around the perimeter of the venue, moved with terrifying, blinding speed. 4 massive men, dressed in sharp, identical black suits, intercepted him in midair. The impact was swift, clinical, and utterly brutal in its efficiency. They did not shout warnings. They simply executed their job. They tackled Marcus, slamming him down onto the polished marble stage with a heavy bone-rattling thud that reverberated through the floorboards. 2 guards instantly pinned his arms securely behind his back, locking his wrists in an uncompromising grip, while a third pressed a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades, completely neutralizing his momentum. Marcus thrashed wildly against the marble floor, screaming incoherently. He kicked his legs, his expensive shoes, scraping uselessly against the stone, his face pressed painfully right next to the discarded engagement ring. "Let me go!" he howled, spittle flying from his lips as he struggled against the sheer physical force holding him down. "She ruined me! Get off me!" The lead security officer, a towering man named Vance, leaned down slightly. He applied just a fraction more pressure to Marcus's shoulder, instantly cutting off the groom's thrashing. "Stay entirely still," Mr. Sterling Vance warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "If you attempt to move toward my client again, the consequences will be severe and immediate. Do not test me." The elite guests in the audience gasped, shrinking back in their chairs. The sight of the polished, arrogant Marcus Sterling pinned to the floor of his own wedding reception like a common criminal was a visual they would never ever forget. Down on the floor, Beatrice let out a horrified shriek, seeing her golden child restrained by force, but she was too weak and terrified to intervene. It was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation for the Sterling brand. I looked down at the pathetic thrashing display at my feet. "You ruined yourself, Marcus," I stated, my voice slicing effortlessly through his frantic shouts. "I did not force you to sign away your parental rights. I did not force you to squander your trust fund on bad investments, and I certainly did not force you to betray me 5 years ago. I simply bought the mirror and held it up for the entire city to see. You are the sole architect of your own destruction." I turned my attention away from him, completely dismissing his existence, and looked back down at the center table. Leo, Lance, and Lily had remained perfectly seated. They watched the commotion with the calm, detached curiosity of children who knew they were completely and entirely safe. They had not shed a tear or shown a single ounce of fear. They were my true masterpieces, raised to be unshakable in the face of chaos. I raised my hand, signaling the secondary unit of my security detail. "Escort the children to the Maybach," I commanded smoothly. "It is time we conclude our business here." Our evening is finished. The guards immediately formed a protective, impenetrable wall around my children, guiding them safely away from the velvet table and toward the grand exit. The high society crowd parted for them with a newfound, terrified reverence. I looked down at Marcus one last time. He was panting heavily against the cold floor, his eyes wide and completely broken, realizing that I was walking away with his entire world. I stepped around him, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the cold marble beneath his face and the crushing weight of his own consequences. The legal and financial destruction of the Sterling family was swift, absolute, and painfully public. The hostile takeover of the Sterling Family Trust was completely finalized less than 48 hours after the wedding reception. Vanguard Horizon's legal team descended upon the Sterling estate like an unstoppable force of nature, executing the immediate freeze of every single asset Marcus and Beatrice had wrongfully claimed. The corporate board of Sterling Enterprises, led by Elias Montgomery, formally voted to permanently remove Marcus from his position as chief executive officer. The vote was unanimous. Marcus was escorted out of his own corporate headquarters by the very security team he used to command, carrying nothing but a small cardboard box of personal items. He was officially stripped of his salary, his corporate expense accounts, and his unearned pride. Beatrice Sterling's downfall was even more spectacular. The matriarch who had spent her entire life ruling over Atlanta high society with an iron fist was brutally dethroned. Because the Buckhead estate was legally owned by the trust, and because I was now the sole conservator of that trust, she was formally served with an eviction notice. She had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. The woman who had thrown me out onto the driveway 5 years ago was now being forced to pack up her designer wardrobe and leave the only home she had known for 4 decades. She attempted to leverage her connections, calling judges politicians and wealthy friends, desperately begging for a loan or a legal loophole. Not a single person answered her calls. In a social circle that worshipped wealth and power, Beatrice was now viewed as a toxic liability. She had been publicly exposed as a cruel, manipulative fraud who had attempted to steal from her own grandchildren. She was entirely radioactive. Marcus became the ultimate cautionary tale of the Atlanta elite. Without his massive trust fund to hide his incompetence, the true depth of his financial ruin became glaringly obvious. The shadow loans he had taken out to fund Chloe's extravagant wedding defaulted immediately. The private equity groups came collecting ruthless in their pursuit of repayment. Marcus was forced to liquidate his remaining personal assets, selling his luxury vehicles and his collection of expensive watches just to keep the debt collectors at bay. He was entirely blacklisted from every country club, charity gala, and corporate boardroom in the state. He was a broke, humiliated outcast, forced to rent a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a mid-level administrative job just to survive. The arrogant corporate heir was completely dead. In his place was a broken, exhausted man who had to wake up every single morning knowing he had thrown away a billion-dollar empire because he was too impatient to wait for a second medical opinion. Chloe, true to her opportunistic nature, officially filed for an annulment the very next morning. She completely scrubbed her social media accounts, erasing every trace of Marcus and their disastrous wedding. She attempted to pivot, trying to charm her way back into the good graces of the wealthy bachelors in her social circle, but the damage was irreversible. She had publicly abandoned a sinking ship, proving her absolute lack of loyalty. The men she tried to manipulate saw right through her desperate facade. She was quietly, politely ostracized from the high society she had fought so hard to infiltrate, relegated to the very outskirts of the elite world she thought she had conquered. Liam and Nia were the only members of the extended family to emerge completely unscathed. They formally distanced themselves from Marcus and Beatrice, choosing instead to focus entirely on their own careers and their growing family. Liam continued his successful practice as a corporate attorney, his reputation actually enhanced by his display of uncompromising integrity during the wedding reception. He had proven that he valued the law over toxic family loyalty, a trait that earned him the profound respect of the city's top legal minds. I maintained a cordial, respectful professional relationship with him, occasionally consulting his firm on corporate matters. We never discussed Marcus or Beatrice again. They were completely irrelevant to our shared future. The Sterling family name, once synonymous with old money and unyielding power, had been completely redefined. It no longer represented the arrogant, cruel legacy of Beatrice and Marcus. It now represented the intelligence, the resilience, and the absolute supremacy of Leo Lance and Lily. I had not just protected my children's inheritance. I had completely purged the toxic rot that had infected their bloodline. I had secured their future, ensuring they would never have to endure the manipulative, superficial environment that had almost destroyed me. The empire was safe, and the monsters had been permanently banished to the shadows. The cold, suffocating marble of the Sterling estate dissolved entirely into a distant memory. The blinding flashes of the society cameras, the chaotic, desperate shouting, and the profound humiliation of my former family faded away, replaced by the soft golden afternoon sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Buckhead penthouse. I sat back against the plush white leather of my sofa, feeling the profound, unshakable warmth of my own home. I raised my porcelain teacup to my lips, taking a slow, calming sip of the herbal blend. The heavy gold-foiled wedding invitation that had been sitting on my glass coffee table just hours ago was now buried deep at the bottom of the trash bin, exactly where it belonged. Down the hallway, the brilliant melodic sound of unrestrained laughter filled the air. Leo Lance and Lily were back in their playroom, thoroughly exhausted from their flawless performance at the reception. They had traded their custom-tailored Italian suits and crimson silk for comfortable pajamas. They were currently in the process of loudly knocking over the massive wooden block fortress they had built earlier that morning, cheering wildly as the pieces scattered across the thick carpet. I listened to their joy, feeling a massive wave of absolute peace wash over my entire soul. They were safe. They were completely insulated from the toxic, superficial world that had tried to claim them as property. They were allowed to just be children, free from the crushing weight of a family name that demanded perfection in exchange for basic affection. Looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline, I realized that true victory does not actually feel like vengeance. Vengeance is frantic, emotional, and deeply exhausting. What I felt was the quiet, absolute serenity of pure autonomy. For 5 years, I had carried the heavy, suffocating memory of being discarded. I had remembered the way Marcus and Beatrice looked at me as if I were a defective product, a worthless investment that needed to be liquidated immediately. Society often conditions women to internalize that kind of rejection. We are taught to quietly accept our assigned roles, to shrink ourselves to make others comfortable, and to walk away gracefully when we are told we no longer hold any value. I completely refused to shrink. Instead, I chose to expand until my shadow covered their entire existence. In the elite circles of Atlanta, legacy is treated as an absolute religion. The heritage societies, the exclusive galas, and the country club politics are all meticulously designed to keep power isolated and guarded. Beatrice and Marcus weaponized that culture against me, using their generational status to brand me as an outsider who spectacularly failed to meet their impossible superficial standards. They honestly believed their old money shielded them from any real consequences. But I learned that new money built on pure grit, flawless strategy, and unyielding determination can easily buy out the old guard. I did not just infiltrate their highly exclusive world. I legally purchased the very foundation it was built upon. I realized very early on that you cannot defeat people like the Sterlings by appealing to their morality, because they simply do not possess any. You cannot win by crying, by pleading, or by trying to prove your worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. You defeat the masters of the game by silently learning their language. You defeat them by mastering the intricate systems of elite power, the corporate law, the venture capital, the irrevocable trust funds, and using those very systems to rewrite the rulebook while they are too busy admiring their own reflections to notice. Marcus and Beatrice used their wealth as a weapon to control, manipulate, and terrorize anyone they deemed inferior. I took that weapon directly out of their hands. I studied the brutal, unforgiving architecture of generational wealth, and I used it to construct an impenetrable fortress around my children. Corporate law is entirely devoid of emotion, and that makes it the most beautiful tool for absolute justice. I did not rely on screaming matches or dramatic emotional appeals. I relied on airtight contracts, corporate acquisitions, and the cold, unyielding reality of legal guardianship. My children will never have to earn their right to be loved. They will never have to perform for the approval of a matriarch who views them as living, breathing stock options. By legally severing Marcus from their lives, I did not deprive them of a father. I systematically protected them from a dangerous narcissist. I ensured that the only legacy they will inherit is one of strength, authenticity, and profound self-respect. They will grow up knowing that their mother walked into a room designed specifically to humiliate her, and she walked out holding the title to the entire empire. The world will always try to hand you a narrative. People who are intimidated by your potential will try to write a story where you are the failure, the victim, or the collateral damage. They will print that story on expensive cardstock and mail it directly to your front door. But you hold the absolute power to reject their delivery. You hold the power to pick up the pen and write an entirely different ending. When Marcus handed me that wedding invitation, he told me he had booked me a safe little seat at the singles table. He wanted me to sit quietly in the dark corner of the room and watch him celebrate a future built entirely on my devastation. He completely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I did not just refuse to sit at his pathetic table. I bought the entire venue, I bought his corporate board, I bought his family trust, and I claimed his entire legacy for my children. I took one final sip of my tea, watching the vibrant orange and purple hues of the sunset paint the sky above the city. The storm was officially over. The toxic past was permanently buried. I set the porcelain teacup down on the polished glass table, listening to the beautiful, unburdened laughter of my children echoing down the hall. The empire was completely secure, and our real lives were finally beautifully beginning.